Most people wake up every morning believing they are in control of their lives. They choose their routines, chase their goals, and react to whatever the day throws at them. Yet very few ever stop to question who is actually making those choices. The truth is uncomfortable. Many decisions are made long before logic gets involved, shaped by habits, fears, and emotional reflexes that operate quietly in the background. This is where the story begins, not with success or failure, but with a realization. A realization that if the mind is left unmanaged, it does not remain neutral. It gets programmed by repetition, influence, and convenience. And once that programming is complete, it starts running your life on your behalf, whether you agree with it or not. Imagine reaching a point where effort no longer feels enough, where motivation fades quickly, and where the same patterns keep repeating despite your best intentions. Not because you lack ability, but because something internal keeps pulling you back to familiar ground. How to own your own mind doesn't open by promising quick wins or external hacks. It opens by quietly exposing the real battlefield, one where victories are invisible, but losses compound over time. This is not a story about changing circumstances. It's about confronting the invisible forces that dictate reactions, stall progress, and shape identity. And once you see those forces clearly, you can't unsee them. That awareness alone begins to change the way every thought feels. What makes this journey unsettling is that there is no one else to blame by the end of it. The book slowly pulls the reader into a deeper question. If thoughts can be trained, emotions regulated, and habits redesigned, then who is responsible for the outcomes we tolerate? This is the loop the story creates and refuses to let go of. Because the moment you accept that the mind can be owned, you're also forced to confront the cost of not owning it. And that question lingers beneath every chapter that follows, quietly demanding an answer as the story unfolds. Chapter 1: The Awakening of Control. Chapter 1 opens with a confrontation, not an introduction. It challenges the comforting belief that most people are already thinking for themselves. Instead, it suggests that the majority of thoughts we accept as our own are inherited, picked up from repetition, environment, and emotional habit. The mind, Hill explains, is not naturally disciplined or purposeful. Left alone, it drifts toward convenience, familiarity, and reaction. This chapter sets the tone by making one thing clear. Mental ownership is not a trait you're born with. It's a condition you either develop intentionally or never experience at all. As the chapter unfolds, the reader is guided toward a difficult realization that personal freedom does not begin with opportunity, intelligence, or effort. It begins with awareness. Awareness of how often decisions are made automatically, without reflection or direction. Hill frames this as the first quiet loss of control, when a person allows thoughts to respond to life rather than shape it. In this state, the mind becomes a receiver instead of a creator, absorbing emotions from circumstances and opinions from others, all while believing it is acting independently. The chapter then shifts its focus to responsibility, a concept that feels heavier the longer it's examined. Hill argues that ownership of the mind begins the moment a person accepts full accountability for their mental state, regardless of pressure, environment, or past experiences. This idea is unsettling because it removes every convenient excuse. If thoughts can be governed, then emotional reactions are no longer accidents. They are choices, whether consciously made or not. And once this perspective settles in, it changes the way setbacks, conflict, and uncertainty are interpreted. Hill uses this chapter to expose how easily the mind can be influenced when it lacks direction. Fear enters unnoticed. Doubt disguises itself as realism. Procrastination hides behind logic. These forces don't announce themselves. They integrate quietly into daily thinking. The chapter reads like a slow unveiling, revealing that loss of control rarely feels dramatic. It feels normal. And that normalcy is exactly what makes mental drift so dangerous. People don't realize they've surrendered control because nothing appears to be taken from them all at once. By the end of the chapter, the reader is left standing at a mental crossroads. One path continues as before, reacting, justifying, and adapting to whatever appears. The other demands deliberate thought, self-observation, and discipline. Hill doesn't push the reader toward either path. Instead, he leaves them with a sharper awareness of choice. And once that awareness exists, the story truly begins. Because from this point forward, every thought carries the weight of intention or neglect. Chapter 2. The Invisible Enemy. Chapter 2 shifts the focus inward, toward forces that rarely draw attention because they feel so familiar. After the realization of mental ownership in the first chapter, Hill introduces what quietly stands in the way of it. These obstacles don't arrive as dramatic crises. They arrive as moods, delays, and rational-sounding thoughts. Fear, doubt, worry, and procrastination are presented not as emotions to be eliminated, but as signals of an undisciplined mind. This chapter makes it clear that before the mind can be owned, it must first be understood, especially the ways it undermines itself while pretending to protect you. As the chapter unfolds, fear takes center stage, not as panic but as hesitation. Hill describes how fear disguises itself as caution, how doubt pretends to be intelligence, and how indecision often wears the mask of preparation. These mental states feel reasonable, which is why they're so effective. They slow momentum just enough to keep action uncomfortable but not painful enough to provoke change. The reader begins to see that these inner enemies don't block progress outright. They erode it quietly, one delayed decision at a time. Hill then explores how these forces gain strength through repetition. A single moment of doubt doesn't shape a life, but habitual doubt does. The mind learns patterns quickly, especially emotional ones. When fear is entertained without challenge, it becomes familiar. When procrastination is justified once, it returns more easily the next time. This chapter emphasizes that the mind does not judge whether a habit is useful or destructive. It simply reinforces whatever is practiced most consistently. What makes this chapter particularly unsettling is the realization that these mental enemies are self-sustaining. They don't require external pressure to survive. In fact, they often thrive in comfort. Hill explains that many people mistake emotional stability for mental control, never realizing that avoidance has quietly replaced discipline. The mind begins to protect comfort rather than pursue growth, and over time, this trade-off becomes invisible. The danger isn't fear itself, it's becoming so accustomed to it that it feels normal. By the end of the chapter, the reader understands that ownership of the mind isn't threatened by dramatic failure, but by subtle surrender. The enemies described here don't announce their presence. They blend into daily thinking and call it realism. Hill leaves the reader with a sharpened awareness. If these forces are allowed to operate unchecked, they will always choose safety over progress. And recognizing them is the first step towards stripping them of their influence. Chapter 3. Habit, the Silent Architect. Chapter 3 turns attention to a force that shapes the mind more powerfully than emotion or intention: habit. Hill presents habit as the silent architect of behavior, working patiently in the background while attention is focused elsewhere. By this point in the journey, the reader understands the need for mental ownership, but this chapter introduces a sobering truth. Awareness alone is not enough. The mind follows patterns, and those patterns are built through repetition, not resolve. Without addressing habit, even the strongest intentions eventually lose momentum. As the chapter develops, Hill explains how habits form without asking for permission. The mind is designed to conserve energy, and repetition creates efficiency. Thoughts that are repeated become automatic, and actions that are practiced become default responses. Over time, the line between choice and instinct blurs. What once required effort begins to happen unconsciously. This is where most people lose control without realizing it, not through major decisions, but through the daily repetition of small, unchecked behaviors that slowly define who they become. Hill emphasizes that habits are neutral by nature. They do not resist or support success. They simply obey instruction. The problem is that most instruction is accidental. Emotional reactions, inconsistent discipline, and scattered focus train the mind without intention. The chapter highlights how people often blame circumstances for outcomes that were quietly shaped by years of habitual thinking. Once this connection becomes clear, the reader begins to understand that lasting change cannot occur without redesigning the routines that govern thought and behavior. The chapter then shifts from diagnosis to direction. Hill explains that replacing destructive habits requires deliberate persistence, not intensity. The mind resists sudden change but adapts well to consistent input. New habits must be introduced with patience, reinforced daily, and protected from contradiction. This process is neither fast nor dramatic, which is why so few people commit to it, but it is reliable. The reader starts to see that discipline is less about force and more about structure. By the end of chapter 3, habit is no longer seen as a background detail. It becomes the central mechanism of control. The reader is left with a powerful realization. The mind is always being trained, whether intentionally or not. If habits are left to form on their own, they will mirror convenience and comfort. But if they are designed with purpose, they become the strongest allies in mental ownership. From this point forward, the story is no longer about knowing what to change, but about repeating it until the mind accepts it as normal. Chapter 4, Self-Discipline as Power. Chapter 4 introduces discipline, not as punishment or restriction, but as the defining line between intention and execution. By this stage in the journey, the reader understands awareness, inner resistance, and habit, yet something still stands between knowing and doing. Hill positions self-discipline as the force that bridges that gap. Without it, even well-designed habits weaken under pressure. This chapter reframes discipline as an act of self-respect, a conscious decision to govern impulses rather than be governed by them. As the chapter unfolds, Hill challenges the common belief that discipline limits freedom. Instead, he reveals the opposite. Lack of discipline hands control over to emotion, distraction, and circumstance. The undisciplined mind reacts quickly but regrets slowly. It seeks relief before results and comfort before growth. Through this lens, discipline becomes less about rigid control and more about delayed gratification, the ability to pause, choose, and act with intention even when motivation fades. Hill then explores emotional control as the core of discipline. He explains that emotions themselves are not the enemy, unchecked emotions are. Anger, excitement, fear, and desire all carry energy, but without direction, that energy turns destructive. This chapter emphasizes that the disciplined mind does not suppress emotion, it channels it. Instead of allowing feelings to dictate behavior, discipline allows behavior to be guided by purpose, regardless of emotional weather. The chapter also addresses resistance, the internal friction that arises whenever discipline is applied. Hill makes it clear that resistance does not disappear with practice, it becomes familiar. Each time discipline is exercised, the mind learns that discomfort is survivable. Over time, what once felt difficult begins to feel normal. This gradual shift is critical because it marks the moment when self-control stops requiring constant effort and starts operating as a default state. By the end of chapter 4, discipline is no longer viewed as something imposed, but something claimed. The reader begins to understand that every disciplined action strengthens mental authority, while every surrendered impulse weakens it. Hill leaves the reader with a subtle but powerful conclusion. Freedom is not the absence of control, but the ability to direct it. And from this point on, the mind is no longer simply being trained, it is being governed. Chapter 5, Learning from Defeat. Chapter 5 shifts the narrative toward moments most people try to avoid: setbacks, mistakes, and apparent failure. Up to this point, the journey has focused on building control, but Hill now introduces the tests that reveal whether that control is real. Failure, he explains, is not an interruption of progress. It is the environment where mental ownership is either proven or abandoned. This chapter reframes defeat as a signal rather than a verdict. asking the reader to examine not what went wrong, but how the mind responds when things don't unfold as planned. As the chapter develops, Hill challenges the instinctive reaction to failure, emotional withdrawal. Discouragement, resentment, and self-doubt often arrive immediately after disappointment, not because they are unavoidable, but because they are habitual. The undisciplined mind interprets failure as personal judgment, while the disciplined mind treats it as information. This distinction is crucial. One reaction leads to stagnation, the other to adjustment. The chapter quietly presses the reader to notice which response has guided their past decisions. Hill then explores how repeated failure, when unmanaged, erodes confidence. Each setback leaves a psychological imprint, and without conscious control, those imprints accumulate. Over time, expectation replaces possibility, and fear of repetition begins to shape behavior. This is how failure gains influence, not through the event itself, but through the meaning assigned to it. Hill emphasizes that meaning is a mental choice, and ownership of the mind determines whether failure becomes a lesson or a limit. The chapter also reveals why many people abandon discipline after defeat. In moments of loss, emotional reasoning feels justified. Quitting, delaying, or lowering standards appears logical when disappointment is fresh. Hill explains that this is precisely when discipline matters most. The mind must be trained to remain steady under pressure, not just when conditions are favorable. Consistency during adversity is what separates temporary control from permanent mastery. By the end of Chapter 5, failure is stripped of its power to define identity. The reader begins to understand that setbacks are inevitable, but surrender is optional. Hill leaves a lasting impression. The mind that is truly owned does not avoid failure. It absorbs it, analyzes it, and uses it as fuel. From this point forward, progress is no longer measured by uninterrupted success, but by the ability to remain mentally directed when progress is challenged. Chapter 6: The Power of Thought Direction. Chapter 6 moves the focus from reaction to intention, introducing the idea that thoughts themselves must be directed with purpose. By this stage, the reader understands discipline, habit, and resilience, but Hill now emphasizes a deeper layer of control, the ability to choose what the mind consistently thinks about. This chapter suggests that mental ownership is incomplete if thoughts are allowed to wander without aim. A mind that lacks direction may still be disciplined, but it will never be powerful. As the chapter unfolds, Hill explains that most thinking is passive. Thoughts drift toward whatever is most recent, emotional, or familiar. Without conscious direction, the mind revisits worries, past experiences, and imagined problems repeatedly. Over time, these patterns shape perception and expectation. Hill makes it clear that results are not only influenced by action, but by the quality and focus of sustained thought that precedes action. The mind becomes skilled at producing what it rehearses most often. Hill then introduces the concept of concentration as a trained ability rather than a natural gift. Focus, he argues, strengthens with use and weakens with neglect. The scattered mind produces scattered outcomes. This chapter highlights how deliberate thinking, focused on a specific purpose, creates clarity, efficiency, and momentum. When thoughts are aligned toward a single aim, effort feels more effective because mental energy is no longer divided. The chapter also warns of the danger of unfocused mental consumption. Ideas, opinions, and information enter the mind constantly, shaping beliefs without consent. Hill explains that directed thinking requires selective attention, the discipline to decide which thoughts are worth entertaining. Without this filter, even disciplined habits can be undermined by conflicting mental input. Control of thought direction becomes a form of self-defense. By the end of Chapter 6, the reader understands that ownership of the mind is not just about restraint, but about creation. The disciplined mind does not merely avoid distraction, it actively builds vision. Hill leaves the reader with a defining insight. What you think about most becomes the framework through which you interpret reality. And once that framework is chosen intentionally, the mind shifts from reacting to life to shaping it. Conclusion. As the journey comes to an end, the message of how to own your own mind settles into something quieter but far more demanding than motivation. The book does not promise that life will become easier once the mind is disciplined. It promises that it will become clearer. Clarity changes how struggle is experienced. It removes confusion, replaces emotional chaos with intention, and shifts responsibility inward. By now, the reader understands that mental ownership is not a destination reached once, but a practice maintained daily. Every thought, habit, and reaction either strengthens that ownership or slowly gives it away. What lingers most powerfully is the realization that nothing external needs to change for control to begin. Circumstances will continue to fluctuate, pressure will remain unavoidable, and uncertainty will never fully disappear. Yet the mind that has learned discipline, direction, and resilience no longer depends on favorable conditions to remain steady. Hill's message closes the loop that opened the story. The greatest influence over outcomes has always been internal. Ignoring that truth allows life to dictate direction. Accepting it places direction back into your hands. If this story has done anything, it has quietly challenged a single assumption: that your thoughts must behave the way they always have. They don't. Ownership begins the moment you decide to observe them, guide them, and hold them accountable. And that decision is not dramatic or public. It happens privately, in moments of hesitation, discipline, and choice. The question left behind is simple but unavoidable. Now that you know the mind can be owned, what will you do the next time it tries to lead you instead?